It says it's live, so hopefully we've done this. Everybody in my group knows that it never has gone smoothly for me, no matter what I've done. Oh, I see it popped up. Perfect. Okay. Yes, everyone in my group knows I'm technologically terrible. Like, you would think I was like a 95-year-old who just dropped into the planet from somewhere that, like, from full horse and buggy to Facebook and like nothing in between. I'm so bad.
This is kind of the story of my life as well. I'm always like, my brain has grown slow and steady because I am a functional medicine practitioner and a mom and an author, and social stuff is like a secondary world that I just am passively doing.
Yeah, it's awful. It's so hard.
Yeah,
it seems to be easy for other people, but I don't know. So, hello, Keto Reset Group. I'm so excited to have Allie Miller with us here today. Hi, Allie. Let me give you a brief intro for people who aren't familiar with you, and then we will launch right into it. Okay.
Let's do it.
So, Allie Miller, you are an RD, a registered dietitian, an LD, a licensed dietitian, and a CDE, which is a certified diabetes educator. So you have, according to what I know about you from binge listening to your podcast that I've only recently found, and I literally have been binge listening to it for like 3 weeks now. So you have over a decade of experience working in a functional medicine and integrative medicine approach. And I know that a keto diet is a big part of that for you, which is why I'm so excited to have you on here to talk about how you use keto in your practice, with your clients, with your remote clients, in terms of just overall health, and then dealing with specific issues that are related to hormones and weight, and just all the many approaches you take with a keto diet. So before we even launch into it, I just want to point people from my group, if you're interested in finding Allie more, you can find her on AllieMillerRD.com. That's ALIMillerRD.com. And her podcast, which I am deeply in love with and I've learned so much from already, is Naturally Nourished, which you can find on any of the podcast apps you use. And Allie, thank you so much for being here. I know you must be incredibly busy. You have a little kid, you have a practice, you have a podcast, you have a blog. And so I really appreciate you taking the time to be here with us.
It's my pleasure. I'm stoked to be here and answer everyone's questions that came in and talk about my approach and some of the elements that are a little bit unique that might resonate with a lot of the viewers today.
Yeah. So would you please just start by telling us like a brief background, how you got into this space, and then how you're using keto today in your practice?
Sure. So like you said, I'm a registered dietitian. What's unique to my background is I went to a functional integrative program through Bastyr University, which is a naturopathic college. So where a lot of dietitians, unfortunately, that are doing more of an ancestral approach have to kind of walk opposing from what they're learning, I suppose, in their educational didactic programs. I was learning about things like bone broth, and I was able to do wild mushroom foraging and really learn about the elements of how nature and science collide, both with traditional modalities of healing and little bits of flares of things like traditional Chinese medicine, and then marrying that with more of an allopathic conventional medicine approach. And so I went to the Texas Medical Center, and that's where I did my rotations. I worked for a physician's clinic for the first 3 years of my career, and there I managed dysmetabolic syndrome, which essentially is like elevated cholesterol, elevated blood pressure, and blood sugar. So diabetes, hypertension, hyperlipidemia, and weight gain and obesity. And so I ran a weight loss program for this physician, and she was doing like a really low quality weight loss shake type approach. It was a VLCD. This was in 2009. And so this was a VLCD, a very low calorie diet, and it was ketogenic-ish. I mean, it was 50 to 60 grams of carbs, but it had things like soy isolated protein and such. So I said to her, I will use keto, and I'm all about this metabolic shift, but we have to use whole real foods. So I developed a program for her that was a year-long program, and ran that for 3 years, and then worked as a functional practitioner for more of the 8 to 5. The programs were in the evening and weekends. And then I opened Naturally Nourished in 2011 or 12, I guess. Yeah, 2012. And that's where I kind of hang my hat still today. I work virtually. I have a now virtual food as medicine ketosis program. And I ran in my clinic in Houston prior to that, a program in person. And the whole idea of my approach to keto is considering it as a metabolic state and understanding that it has hormetic influence in the body. So it's going to influence the way that our sexual hormone is expressed. It's going to influence the way that our adrenals are impacted, as well as our thyroid and other glands of focus that influence metabolism. And we have to understand with each individual that we're going to have different metabolic flexibility and different things that work well for us, which makes, I think, my practice a little bit less sexy because it doesn't have like a one size fits all super magic bullet. But it's really important that we all acknowledge the feedback of our bodies and work with why things might not be flowing, and then recalibrating and really working for long-term sustainable outcomes and whole body healing. And that all starts with whole real food.
Yeah, that was one of the first things that attracted me to your podcast, is because I feel like we have a really similar attitude towards keto, which is that food quality comes first.
Yeah.
And then we start with a set of, guidelines that we are like, okay, this is a reasonable jumping off point for you. But then after that, we have to take into account your bioindividuality, what you like to eat, what your stress level is. And I very much in the same way shy away from a one size fits all approach. And I encourage people to run away from a one size fits all approach, because it's completely disrespectful to the body, and it's very unlikely to work for the majority of people. And then people blame themselves. And I think that's such a shame. Or they blame keto as a philosophy, which is also a shame.
Right. I think, I always tell people, when you have to white knuckle an approach, it's probably not the right approach. You need to recalibrate. And one of my favorite mantras that I use pretty much daily, or in like 80% of my podcast, is this whole doctrine creates disconnect, because it's really something I had to personally learn. I was a vegan when I was at Bastyr, and I was like hook, line, sink, thought that I was going to save the world and make everyone vegan. Like that was going to be the way, and all of the things. And it took me a really intensive learning curve, both personally, experientially, with a lot of the digestive distress, leaky gut. I was diagnosed with hypothyroid, Hashimoto's, and was dealing with panic attacks, really. And when we looked at my ferritin levels, they were at like a 3. And I was just losing handfuls of hair and, dealing with neuropathy and shortness of breath. And I was just so ingrained with the fact that this is what I needed to eat, that my body was essentially screaming at me that it was not nourished. And so I'm really into whatever approach we're using, we have to watch and adjust and modify and be mindful that something that worked amazing for you in this time stamp is going to work differently for you in 3 years, in 6 months, in a different stress time, in a different sexual hormone shift. And so we need to be flexible within that.
So then, like, who are your clients that are coming to you? Like, what kind of things are they presenting with? And then do you use I know you use food, of course, as a primary modality for treatment, but do you use keto with most of them? Like, how do you kind of strike that balance in terms of understanding when keto is and is not appropriate?
Yeah. So my clients are majority women, probably like 80% women. And most of them ranging from mid-20s into mid-60s, I would say. So pretty wide age range. I have some past that, but most are kind of in that world. And I work with still a lot of metabolic conditions. I do a lot of work now with the gut, a lot of microbiome stuff. I work a lot with digestive distress, whether it's from bowel regularity to bloating and distension, to, like I said, SIBO, dysbiosis, candidiasis. I work with elimination diets and food sensitivities and autoimmune conditions as a big world. And I work with what I call a lot of zebras in the most compassionate, lovely way. People that don't fit a diagnostic code, who keep being told that everything's normal or within range, but they're trying to listen to the yells, and they went from a whisper or a murmur to a yell to a scream in their body saying something isn't right, waking up in the middle of the night at 3 a.m. on a regular basis. losing your period out of the blue, having these changes that unfortunately, dealing with migraines, right? And a lot of times, unfortunately, there's either a Band-Aid approach in the conventional medical model to just silence the symptom, or we're just told it's normal and kind of deal with it, versus really investigative approach. And so I approach each patient as like a detective of the body. And I really try to tie together what is the root cause, but also what were like the triggering antecedent events. What were the drivers that perpetuated this expression, and how can we reset and address from the root to really treat versus silence? So that's kind of a pretty broad, but, and then I'd say a huge component of people that just want optimal health, and a lot of women's hormones and infertility for sure as well.
So why do you think, like, besides the obvious, the fact that the food quality is fairly poor and like in the most traditional, like standard American diet, but even for people who are, trying to be healthy nowadays, like, why do you think that there's such a prevalence with things like gut issues, hormone imbalances? I mean, do you feel like you have pinpointed kind of a few key things that seem to link your clients person to person?
Well, one of my huge ones, which is the premise of my book that came out last fall, is anxiety and HPA-axis dysregulation. I really find that whether we feel comfortable deeming it as anxiety, because a lot of people don't, or just high stress demand or mismanaged stress response, or, intensive, like I said, stress hit. If we are not getting enough balance in the parasympathetic state, so the fight or flight response of the body, this is our sympathetic stress response. If we're constantly running in sympathetic mode, we are in fight or flight mode, and we're not allowing that balance of regulatory function. We're more in reactive state. So if you're functioning in a reactive state, you're missing out on the parasympathetic balance that influences on a regulatory level our circadian rhythm, our energy, our sleep patterns, our metabolism. The thyroid is greatly influenced by that parasympathetic state. And then we think of, rest and digest. So also the digestive tract, our hydrochloric acid production gets depleted under stress. Our digestive enzymes go down under stress. We actually have a compound called LPS, lipopolysaccharide, which is increased. There's been research studies that show that LPS goes up with just social anxiety. So like just being uncomfortable in a group of new people increases this LPS, and LPS literally drills holes in your gut lining. It's like wild. It usually is elevated in the presence of a pathogen or a bad bacteria. So the body says, well, we can't get rid of this for whatever reason. Maybe we don't have enough good bacteria, or, maybe the body's malnourished. So we're going to drill holes in the gut to allow this pathogen to get systemic so we can eradicate it. Well, LPS goes up regardless of pathogen just by the base of stress. So I kind of create this position with the anti-anxiety diet as a functional medicine model of, how anxiety or mismanaged stress can drive and create leaky gut, can drive and create dysbiosis, can deplete our mood stabilizing minerals and the amino acids that we need for our neurotransmitter balance, and then can burn out the adrenals or overdrive the adrenals and imbalance our neurotransmitters. And I find that, each individual might have a different trigger point, but if we don't address the way we respond to stress and become more resilient as a society and disconnect more as a society and say no more as a society, that we're going to be chronically ill. And so I think that that's really where I hone in on with the individuals that I work with.
Yeah, I think that's so interesting, because it seems like very recently in the space, there's an increasing understanding of like the gut is tied to your mental health, is tied to your stress level, is tied to your sex hormones, oh gosh, it's all been connected this whole time. And I think that it's awesome that your book, which by the way, I just ordered 2 copies of, one for me and one for a friend who very much needs it. And I will link to a copy of the book in the show notes, you guys, after the video post. I will put it in the comments below, along, of course, with Allie's blog, and with a link to the podcast as well. Cool. But I really love this holistic approach of trying to not just pinpoint one symptom at a time, but take this more global approach of, okay, what are the common threads that I could, what are the big picture items I could tick off here and start to heal this and that and this and that, rather than like tiny pieces at a time.
Yes.
And
Because go ahead.
go ahead. I was gonna say, is it because you work outside the traditional system? Do you think it's easier for you to do that, or is that a really big question?
I mean, right. Yeah. It's like, that's the constant dance. Do you take insurance? No, because I don't like following rules. But I was going to say, if you do, isolate, like when I entered into the realm of functional medicine, when I was working with someone with colitis or, inflammatory bowel disease or Crohn's, I was using like a GAPS approach, which is still within the constructs of how I practice, but it was still some level systematic, right? It was in some level isolated. So I was giving them L-glutamine, for instance, which is an amino acid that fuels our enterocytes, which are our gut cells. And that creates a really stabilized epithelial lining, or the lining of the gut. And that's what we refer to when we're talking about leaky gut. So I'd give them the L-glutamine, and I'd give them maybe the omega-3 to bring down the inflammation, and good quality probiotic strains, and test their stool. But I didn't always consider, it took me like a really iron striking aha moment to consider, well, why? Like, we know in that disease state that often, like the Crohn's disease females tend to be very type A individuals. And beyond that LPS, leaky gut driver with stress, glutamine gets depleted with stress, and we get sterilized in the microbiome. And so there's an earlier entry point, and we can use still tools and functional nutrients to influence the body and heal the body, but we want to know what's perpetuating the imbalance. And that's where I felt like if we don't address this HPA-axis, we're playing whack-a-mole with our symptoms, right? So it's like one, year you nail the leaky gut protocol, woohoo! And then like, okay, you're tolerating more foods, but now your adrenals are shot, and it's this kind of dance. And I think we're seeing that in the wellness wellness-centric community, that there's always like a new kid on the block. I think, we've been talking about leaky gut for a while, but now like the leptin movement and whatnot, there's always something that's kind of the cool thing to focus on. But I think that stress and anxiety maybe will never get as cool, because that means it has to start with lifestyle. It means we have to acknowledge that we're overwhelmed and put up the white flag and say like, okay, I am going to maybe bubble wrap with adaptogens, and maybe I'm going to add and layer things. But at the end of the day, I need to also remove. I need to reframe my perspective, work with, processes of my inner mean girl that's wearing away at my body, and make peace, I think, with ourselves. And I think that's a pretty big, hat to wear, and a big thing to take on for a lot of people.
Yeah, it's huge. And it's not something that's really socially supported. Like we talk lip service to it all the time. Like, yes, reduce stress and start meditating. But we don't say like, and actually like for real, like I'm running a business and I'm going to let my employees, stop emailing at 7 p.m. And, I'm going to encourage people to really take time off. I mean, we can say all these things and do this and that, but the culture right now does not support what you're saying, even though what you're saying, I think, is 100% spot on. And so you really have to truly buck the system in order to advocate for yourself in that way.
Yeah. And like, so with your entry question, or what we were just talking about, like, why is this all happening? I think that's the why. And my book goes into, of course, when we talk about reducing inflammatory foods, we talk about GMOs, we talk about omegas, we talk about structural elements of all of these drivers and things that have changed. In the microbiome element, I talk about sterility with antibiotics and C-section birth versus vaginal and whatnot. But I really think on an influential level, it's this hypothalamic pituitary adrenal. I don't think I've defined that, but which is essentially, again, this feedback mechanism of the pendulum swing of staying in reactive versus regulatory mode. And as we continue to biohack, as we continue to add, it's going to become louder and louder that we probably need to subtract. And I think that's where keto and primal diets fit really well, right? Because we're trying to intermittent fasting, mimicking ancestral elements of being less stimulated by food, allowing that parasympathetic rest mode. We're talking about eating high fat, which you need fat to rebound your hormones and adrenals. And so I think there's a really big overlap. And I use keto in the anti-anxiety diet because the same mechanism of how ketones in the bloodstream actually aid as a treatment for epilepsy, they cross the blood-brain barrier. So our neurotransmitters don't cross the blood-brain barrier. There's a separation between our enteric nervous system of the gut and our central nervous system of the brain and spine. There's feedback. There's neurons that are constant. There's a super highway of information, which is pretty, I think, remarkable of what we're starting to learn. But ketones directly cross the blood-brain barrier. They upregulate GABA. And GABA, I would argue, is a stronger anti-anxiety over serotonin. And GABA is like this inhibitory release in the body, which is profound influence if you're dealing with anxiety or panic or just tight, clenching your jaw, feeling, a little bit intensive. And when ketones cross the blood-brain barrier, it downregulates epinephrine, which is their adrenaline. And that's that steam train surge of what would drive the epileptic seizure activity. So the actual mechanism that would inhibit a seizure helps you to feel more grounded and mellow. And I think that was another aha, 5 years into using keto, my favorite testimonial from people, I didn't care. I mean, it's great when people lose 100 pounds, whatnot, get off their medications, all wonderful things, reduce inflammation. But when people would say, I feel like myself again, I mean, that's it's a weird out there type of testimonial, but I get it. I was like, yes, that's when you're grounded, you're collected, and you feel like yourself again. You are back in the driver's seat of the vehicle of your body, and you're not hanging on to that bumper for dear life, hoping to make through another day. So I think that's the most powerful kind of hit, just those little daily experiential.
So I agree. I say that all the time, that I think it's wonderful that a desire for weight loss is what leads so many people to find the ketogenic diet. But then once they're here, that losing weight is the least interesting and the least compelling reason to stick with it.
Right.
But what I think is really interesting about the keto diet is that, I think one of the problems with traditional diet culture is that we have all these rules like, oh, if you just eat less and exercise more, then this and this and this will happen. And we're trying to layer these rules on top of individual bodies that have been potentially damaged for decades at this point. And so the rules just don't apply anymore. And maybe what keto does in some sense is it helps reset people back to, my phone is ringing. Hold on.
Oh, you're fine. I don't hear it.
It helps reset people back to where they would ideally, or closer to where they would ideally be, and then allows their bodies to start taking over. So are there people in your practice for whom you don't think that keto is necessarily appropriate?
Yeah. Of course. And again, keto would be a doctrine creates disconnect as well. If you are practicing a diet that would support the metabolic process of ketosis, which I know this whole group is familiar, so we don't have to do a 101, right?
Right.
But if you're practicing a diet and you're not producing ketones, one limiting element might be that you have such advanced adrenal fatigue that your DHEA levels are super low. And DHEA plays a huge role as a metabolite to aid with ketone production. So that's one thing where I often will have someone first load with, if I'm always testing, I wouldn't just blindly supplement with DHEA because that can actually drive women androgenic, and even men. They can convert and aromatase their testosterone into estrogen. So you always want to test and understand sexual hormone as well as adrenals and look at that in combination. But that's a limiting factor in audience where I would say I get their DHEA levels at least improved, depending on how low in the dumps they are, so that they can make ketones so they're not in that metabolic disconnect, right? And people, for instance, that are functionally deficient in carnitine. This is an amino acid derivative that plays a big role in fatty acid metabolism. So there's actually a shuttle in our biochemistry called carnitine synthase. And that's actually what drives fat as fuel in the mitochondria. Now, MCTs bypass that, but they're not going to thrive if they have an issue with carnitine metabolism. And then the other limiting group is, of course, eating disordered individuals, which, either knew and had a history of eating disorder. For some people, especially binge eaters, sometimes keto is a great tool because they get that leptin and that satiety, and it can be a powerful reset to have some freedom, especially those that were fat phobic. But for others, any form of a plan can be restrictive and triggering. So I'm mindful of that. And then my other thing with keto is I make my clients choose non-negotiables. So you can be a high intensity athlete. You can consume high amounts of caffeine. Maybe we say caffeine at all, but I would say over 8 ounces of a cup of coffee, more than one caffeinated beverage. And you can sleep less than 8 hours, and be high stress and do keto. But you have to choose 3 of that. You can't do all 5. Like, so if you're going to not sleep and you're going to overly calorie restrict, because that happens often, and over exercise and take it out on the spin bike, then you're not doing yourself a favor by also potentially making your leptin have negative feedback. Because over time with keto, especially women that are of an ideal body weight, we go from leptin resistance to leptin sensitivity. And this is like the high of I can pick up a stranger in the parking lot. Everything's amazing. I can't believe I haven't done this before. And then over time, leptin fluctuates with our sexual hormone. And so for many women, if leptin goes from resistant to sensitive, over time it will get depleted. And this is then when we can get that feedback of a shortened cycle or loss of cycle. And if they're able to let the spin go, or the weight training, or they sleep better, or they reduce their workload, usually we can still make it work. But if they're not willing to make that work, I first start with carb cycling, and then I might even play with just transitioning them to low glycemic. It's going to depend on what factors they have going on that increased output reactive world.
Mm-hmm. Oh my gosh, I have like 20 questions for you now. Okay, so let's just real quick define leptin, and then it almost sounds like we talk a lot in this group about the concept of allostatic load and your stress bucket, and why you have to keep that managed, and why you can't, again, choose 7 things to be type A and high strung about. But it almost sounds like, a lot of the things that maybe we attribute to cortisol or stress in general might actually have more to do with leptin and sex hormones than we're actually giving it credit for.
Sure. And cortisol also, what's interesting is keto can actually aid in, you get this secondary metabolite of cortisol, and you can actually get a good rebound. Like I said, first, the fact that fat is going to rebound all steroid hormone, right? So high fat is in turn going to be the best thing, dietary with vitamin C, going to be the best thing to bring up your cortisol production if you're dealing with adrenal fatigue, and could also balance out sexual hormones if you're dealing with a high cortisol output and progesterone converting into cortisol and getting that pregnenolone steal. High fat can also help in that sense. So I forgot your question. I'm sorry.
Let's just define leptin real fast and talk about.
Yeah. So leptin is a satiety hormone. And so we have many receptors in the body that respond to leptin. And like I said, I think of leptin having a pretty consistent relationship with insulin. So where most people entering from a standard American diet have some level of insulin resistance, right? The early onset to prediabetes and still expressed with type 2 diabetes, where they have really elevated insulin levels and we're not getting that expression. We can get the same deal with leptin, where we get leptin resistant and we're not getting that feedback of satiety. And leptin docks in various places of the body. Predominantly, it's in the hypothalamus. So when we're connecting this, as I've been talking about HPA-axis, that's the H in the HPA-axis. And so our hypothalamus actually also puts out our thyroid releasing hormone. It puts out a lot of regulation on our energy and the input of our calorie and regulation. In fact, we see with disordered eating or over calorie restricting, we call it hypothalamic amenorrhea. So the hypothalamus isn't getting that leptin feedback. And so it starts to say this body is not ready for reproductive health. And so there's a lot of sexual hormone connection as well, as you've acknowledged. And leptin also has dock sites on the thyroid and also on the ovaries. And then there's others through the body, but those are kind of the most significant on a metabolic level. And so as we cycle as women, there's different times, secretory phase of hormone, as well as our onset of our cycle, where leptin levels drop. And so that's my approach with carb cycling in women is we carb cycle post-ovulatory, and we may carb cycle at day 1 and 2 of our period. And I consider the population that this is right for as people that are close to an ideal body weight, have a high stress, and, may not be sleeping optimal, because these are all conditions that lead us to be more leptin depleted.
Mm-hmm. Got it. And I know you cover this a lot in several of your podcast episodes. So again, I will link to those specific ones that deal with leptin and hormones. But I know that this is a big question, for the women in our group, especially, is how do we strike that balance between, supporting our bodies and keeping our cycles regular. And, maybe as we're moving into menopause and our hormones are starting to change. And then also, wanting to be healthy and maybe introduce intermittent fasting and maybe do some caloric restriction, and these things that we hear are, stressors on our body and possibly sending signals to our body that, we're in a nutrient deficiency and not the time to reproduce, and it can be a tricky balance for people to strike on their own and know what the right thing is to do. And air quotes.
There's some known symptoms of low leptin levels that I will identify to be helpful. One would be interrupted sleep. So for men too, because I'll often get people that will hear my podcast and say, oh, well, what about me? I'm a dude. Should I carb cycle? And I always say, if, again, you're at an ideal or low % body fat, if you're dealing with organic signals of hunger, again, think of your transition with keto. You started probably being like, what's food? This is amazing. The freedom that I have of this satiety is like lock and key, just docking, rock and roll, right? But if you're not getting that satiety and all of a sudden, out at a light switch, right? All of a sudden you're craving foods and feeling really unsatiated and also a little bit irritable, short fuse. That's all indicators. Body temperature change, of getting cold more often. Let's see, I mentioned sleep, irritable, hunger. Those are kind of the big ones. And then for women, usually that are cycling a shorter cycle. But, I also state that if those things aren't going on and your cycle is beautiful and you have more than 30 pounds of fat that you still want to lose, you may not need to carb cycle, because your body has more of that endogenous fat and more of that reserve, that you have that flexibility to do the fasting and such. For men, I've seen a variance, and it just depends, but I have one guy I'm thinking of in person that's an attorney, and he loves to do the highest, what's the nootropic of the month and whatever. And he loves to try to do these 5-day water fasts, and the last 3 haven't worked. And he's had shaking and tremors and panic, and he has 8% body fat. And I'm like, well, dude, you're going super low leptin. Your body's telling you, I'm scared, I might not survive. And so that's things we have to listen to.
I love talking about all the hormones, and I love a functional medicine approach and the digging deep. But at the same time, I think it can be intimidating for people who feel like there's so much to know. And, what if I can't find a practitioner in my area? What if I don't have the resources right now to, pay for out of pocket for all this testing, since really, a lot of functional medical people do work outside the traditional insurance model. Right. How do you help people navigate that? Where's the line for you between when people can be doing it on their own and they can do some self-experimentation and they can kind of be listening to podcasts and trying to figure out, versus when it's okay, time to dig deep. This is not working. You need professional help. You need to seek out someone like you for help and really going deep.
And the unfortunate reality is it's a art, just like anything, right? Our skill sets are so unique, and the art of a healer is unique to that individual beyond their training. The intuition and the ability to really listen and hear what your clients are saying and ride with them on the journey, I think is something that's very difficult to find. And unfortunately, just like in the conventional allopathic world, you can find a great functional medicine practitioner that might enter into, $1,500 worth of labs and still treat everyone in a standard algorithm. It may not be, individualized healthcare. And so I just say that kind of in a buyer beware sense, that, there are fantastic resources. I like the IFM, the Institute of Functional Medicine, and they have a find a practitioner, button, and you can search in your zip code. But my whole goal of the anti-anxiety diet and the Naturally Nourished podcast are to really empower the listener or the reader to be thine own doctor and work within their own body and the feedback of it. So in the anti-anxiety diet, I do a quiz at the end of each chapter, at least as an entry point to teach you deeper about like, okay, this is where I need to start. This resonates stronger than that and that. And everyone's going to enter at a different point. You know, someone that's just breastfed a child for a year and carried a child the 9 months prior is probably going to want to hone in on the micronutrient restoration because they've just grown and nourished an entire other human. You know, someone that is, you know, dealing with a job change and a divorce or even might go in at the adrenal chapter and dig deeper. And so I try to compartmentalize so you can have an aha, that's me. And then I walk you through strategic supplement strategy and also advanced labs that you have access to order on my website. You can also, you know, search them and look wherever. And then you can have that conversation with your practitioner. But we've just revamped everything at Ali Miller RD so that if you order a lab, it comes with a customized email review. And that's directly from myself or Becky, who's my podcast co-host. So we try to do that as hopefully that's like our giving back to community to provide an initial resource. And I hope that access, you know, is that empowerment, especially something like an MRT test that gives us, you know, the 180 foods and chemicals that drive inflammation and some of these things that we really can own and don't have to feel like we're going to battle, like to ask for a lipoprotein particle assessment or homocysteine or CRP when our doctor's telling us to get on a statin because our cholesterol is too high, but not looking at what's going on. So access to information, I think, is really where it starts for sure.
And what do you think that are like the baseline that we should all know about ourselves?
Lab wise or
just lab wise? Like, what do you think? Like if I'm trying to do this on my own and, you know, I want to just be as healthy as possible. Like, let's just take off the table that I have any like major diagnoses, right? But I'm just coming to this and I believe in keto as food as medicine. And I, you know, have like the kind of typical, I'm kind of sleepy. I know I don't sleep enough. I know I keep my computer on too late. You know, I have 20 pounds to lose. Like what are the low hanging fruit that should be like in everyone's pocket? Like I should know this about myself. I should be asking my doctor for this. Like we know the sleep and the stress and the lifestyle stuff we talk about all the time in our group, but like what is the next step up in terms of self-knowledge so that you have the baseline to experiment appropriately?
So I would probably drive actually before I would recommend labs to some initial wellness supplement strategy.
Okay.
Because I would suggest getting the bubble wrap and working with the feedback of the body before probably investing it deep. Because for instance, if, you know, there are, like, you know, maybe 10 markers, like everyone should know their C-reactive protein, right? And a base of their inflammation. Looking at homocysteine is a great marker of methylation. So both the building and excretion pathways in the body and also as a vascular marker of inflammation and aggregation or stickiness. You know, then there's just the general like comp CBC. Right. But if I said like, look at your DHEAS, like that's a good thing to look at as a base of the adrenal output. But then it's like, I would want you to look at a 4-point cortisol assessment.
Right.
You know, so it kind of goes rabbit hole from there. So I broadly would say you're better off if you're that person, get on some form of adaptogens. Like in this type of lifestyle, we all need adaptogens. So whether you want to do that in a, you know, all of the different blends of coffee products that are out there now, or, you know, supplemental form, we're talking about things like ashwagandha and panax ginseng and rhodiola and maca, holy basil, like tulsi tea. So we can all bubble wrap, and I suggest everyone taking at least 2 adaptogens a day in some, you know, broad spectrum of, again, bubble wrap perception. And then I, you know, definitely would have everyone check their vitamin D status. And if you're supplementing with D, ensure it has K1, K2. I encourage, if you're not eating 3 servings a week as a minimum of wild caught fish, that you also would take an EPA DHA supplement to keep inflammatory levels regulated. And then ensure that you're eating a probiotic food per day. And if you don't tolerate a probiotic, pickled or fermented food, or varied probiotic products, then that may be indication that you might need to go in a supplemental approach for a gut cleanse first to reset. So, you know, I kind of would do more of those tweaks before I would, for instance, say, go get a stool test for $400. maybe take some berberine and do a gut cleanse. And I really feel that a lot of the natural compounds, if dosed correctly, are of a first do no harm approach, especially when they're pulsed. So, there's your foundational things, but then there's the things that you can do at times of shift or demand.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's actually what I was asking is what is the first do no harm, set your baseline, lay your groundwork so that if there is, something more to be investigated.
Yeah. Probiotics, omega-3s, adaptogens would be my entry point for sure.
That's perfect. Do you have some time for us to do some rapid fire with the questions that came in from our audience?
Sure.
Okay. So this is the part where we start to just get real random because this is just the things that people wanted to know.
Yeah.
So first of all, you mentioned at the very beginning that I don't remember exactly what context, but you mentioned Chinese medicine in here. One of our people in our group wanted to know how you see the integration of different types of modalities like Chinese medicine, acupuncture with functional medicine. Is that something that you do in your practice, is refer out, or is that just something that's completely separate from what you do?
So yeah, they're all in the umbrella of integrative medicine, right? And it's just going to depend on the practitioner. But yes, I refer out often for acupuncture. I think that that's a fantastic treatment. And then there's some TCM herbs that I'm familiar with where, we'll kind of allow hands off the wheel and say, okay, we'll let the acupuncturist work on your wind or work on, what's going on with female hormone. But it really depends on collaboration, and that should be welcomed within your healthcare approach. With that being said, it's also important that all of the cooks in the kitchen have some understanding of at least the mechanism of action. I can't tell you how many times I'm working with a cancer patient and I'm like, well, I do need to know though of that blend that you're drinking with your hot water, if anything is estrogenic, because, you're on tamoxifen and we're pairing that with DIM and turmeric, and we need to be confident in the mechanism of action. So that's something that should always be known based on whoever's prescribing something. You as the patient or the consumer should be empowered with, why am I taking this? And not just a general term. You should have some understanding, and your practitioner should definitely know the mechanism of action, how it works. Because we need to understand some of the biochemical influence if we're using it as a tool of treatment. So I think they're all under integrative medicine, but everyone has a different school of thought for sure.
No, that's a great answer. And I think that people don't probably ask enough questions of their practitioners, partly because they just assume that they know what they're doing. And then partly because it can be uncomfortable to challenge, but you really in any space, whether it's allopathic or integrative or whatever, you need to be an advocate for yourself.
You do.
And choose people who make you feel like they know what they're talking about.
Yeah, for sure. And are listening to you and are comfortable having these conversations and can leave their ego at the door. And you can't connect, I think, on a level with a patient when you're ego driven and you have your own defense mechanism. It needs to be a really fluid experience.
Yeah, that's excellent advice. I hope that everyone goes back and listens to that again. Okay, another completely random question. We'll just start at the top. Okay, so one of our good friends in the group has an adult daughter who was just diagnosed with type 1 diabetes, and he's already been turned on to Dr. Bernstein. Do you know how he says it? Dr. Bernstein with his diabetes solution. And Andrew Kutnick at Florida State, I turned him on to his website. But do you have anything just to add in terms of type 1 obviously being extremely metabolically different from a type 2 diabetic? Keto for type 2 diabetes, anything that he should be looking at, any additional resources he might want to be asking her doctor about?
Well, I always look at, because autoimmune origin beyond, yes, keto can be a fantastic tool. Reducing your reliance on insulin and reducing insulin demand across the board is going to be beneficial for inflammation, and definitely beneficial for regulation of your body when you're dealing with that insulin insufficiency. And so, you're relying on exogenous form in some level. So yes, using fat as your primary fuel is fantastic, but I also like to explore micronutrient deficiencies and also the microbiome, because there's a lot of compelling research on microbiome and type 1 diabetics, as well as like I said, metabolic syndrome and anyone that has dysmetabolic impact, but type 1 diabetics and autoimmune disease in general. So in that camp, I would recommend a good quality, like 60 billion, 50-50 blend of lacto-bifido. And then also consider really paying attention to stool, really paying attention to output, and considering like an annual, I would do a stool test in that population to really target what forms of probiotic strains are necessary.
Interesting. So micronutrients and microbiome with annual stool testing for type 1 diabetics.
Yeah. And like micronutrients, you look at things like alpha lipoic acid, and these are going to help with also your muscular utilization of glucose, right? So you want to think of the nutrients, what mechanisms can your body use to regulate blood sugar that are secondary to the pancreatic insufficiency, and how can you support those as best as possible? And that goes gut and then muscle utilization.
You're such a wealth of information. Okay, I could keep you on here for
I'm the worst at rapid fire because like Becky's always like, God, it's a whole nother episode. It's like, oh, let's talk about it.
No, I love it. I love it.
My husband plates.
Next random question. Do you have any tips for someone whose husband won't stop snoring?
Have you tried mouth tape? I think mouth tape is awesome. I can't think of the name of the brand. There's a couple brands out there, but the one I use is called Lip Seal tape, but there's a couple different ones. Yeah, but that's
I also really like mouth taping.
Yeah, but I would definitely recommend that. Not only is that going to support human growth hormone and deep restorative sleep, I mean, that's where I would definitely start.
Okay, mouth taping. No vitamins here, just mouth taping. Okay, and we have a question about estrogen dominance. I know, again, you've covered that in so many of your podcast episodes, and I've linked to those before in our group. I will link again. Or is there any one particular episode you think is great for estrogen dominance, or any one?
Well, I just did one on endocrine disruptors. I think it's like 116, and that I guess lays out a different influence of estrogen dominance. There's also an episode on women's hormones. And the first thing to determine is, are you estrogen dominance primarily based on excessive estrogen, or are you estrogen dominant secondarily based on relative dominance due to progesterone deficiency? Because you're going to address it very differently. It's also a kind of buzzworthy topic, this estrogen dominance, and Dr. Anthony J is awesome. And there's a lot of resources now about like endocrine disrupting chemicals in our environment. And I think that's a huge influencing factor on why a lot of people are hypothyroid, and why there's a lot of infertility and a lot of, early onset to puberty and what have you, because there's these chemicals in our plastics, our perfumes, and our pesticides that mimic hormone, and they can have totally irregular, higher or lower impact on our sexual hormones. And so estrogen dominance primary, you would want to really get aggressive with like beyond indole-3 carbinols, which is like your cruciferous vegetables like broccoli, cauliflower, what have you. You'd want to probably supplementally take DIM, which is 2 I3C compounds combined. And that's more of a functional estrogen detox. And then if it is high, I would also bring in calcium D-gluconorate, which I use in my ultimate detox formula in my clinic, which helps to detox the estrogen in the colon, because you detox in the liver and the colon. If it's secondary or just relative to progesterone, then I'm working more with maca to help to support the pituitary to make more progesterone. I might even ensure that I'm using a form of bioidentical progesterone with that patient to get them back into that balance. I would definitely in that patient be using carb cycling if they're keto, because progesterone tends to dip in that same general pattern with leptin times of demand, or be in higher demand. So it's a different fish to fry. So I would say the first thing is, you can definitely eat cruciferous. You can get those types of foods for sure. Fiber would be something to support the colon, but anything beyond that in a supplement intervention, you'd probably want to know why. What's the driver? Is it actually you have too much estrogen in the body, or you don't have enough progesterone to counterpoint?
And this is something that you definitely do need to get tested with a practitioner, right?
Like I said, I wouldn't blindly take DIM. Unfortunately, it's in a lot of products. But DIM I've seen drive, low bone density, vaginal dryness, and also like weeping and hot flashes. And so, I mean, DIM is a powerful estrogen detoxifier. The ultimate detox I mentioned, you could take that because that's just calcium D-gluconorate and then more of the phase 2 sulfur compounds, which just drive detox. So that's not going to diminish your estrogen levels. But yeah, with DIM, you should definitely test DIM, DHEA, and then of course any bioidentical hormone, including glandulars, like, adrenal compound even. Those are things that we should test before we take. Adaptogens and base detox support or doing a 10-day detox are all things that we could pulse in and do safely without testing.
And do you think that it's worthwhile for women as they feel like, okay, I'm entering menopause and, I can see that I can feel every day that these shifts are happening in my body. Is it worth, tracking hormones through testing, or is it that a situation in which it's still, okay to do the self-experimentation first? Like at what level does the testing become kind of especially helpful?
I think it just depends more on your symptoms and again, the feedback of the body, right? So if it's a woman that has a beautiful 28-day cycle and like, bless her heart, is one of those girls that's like, oh, my period's tomorrow. Okay. You probably don't have to test if you're looking for fertility. You just take out the goalie and go for it. Right. And just take a good quality prenatal. If someone's dealing with like 32-day, 26-day, if that person's looking for fertility, I would probably say best to test because it might take you a year to get hormone balance. Same thing with menopause. Some people breeze into menopause and they're like, oh, it's been 13 months without a period. I guess I'm in here. And then other people are like, 3 months without a period, like, oh my gosh, I have this edema. I have these flashes. I'm crying. So I think it depends on the experience of the individual of where I would prioritize testing. But yeah, I think that that's a powerful thing. I'm a nerd. I test my hormones at least semi-annually, but that's my world. And so
yeah.
I'm always making sure I'm in like thrive mode. And so that's something I do, but.
No, I love it. When I listen to your podcast and I hear about how like on the ball you are with your own bio rhythms, I'm like, oh, hashtag life goals. So not me at all. Okay. Last question, which again has nothing to do with anything we've talked about before, and I also do not know exactly what this means, but obviously I know it's from one of our members who listens to your podcast and has been following you for a while. She wants to know about your position on seeds and seed oils. Are you particularly fond of flaxseed compared to other seeds, both in the seed form and the oils, or what is up with you and flaxseed? Do you know what the root of this question is?
Probably. So I have a 2-part episode. I think it's like 106 and 107 on birth control.
Oh, is this the natural birth control one?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So I talked to yeah. So that's a good one for like women's hormone resources for sure. So we talk about, impact of birth control first off and synthetic hormone versus bioidentical. And then I cover basically the cycle of our female hormones and what menstruation is. So our follicular and luteinizing hormone and what have you. And I do address seed cycling there in the sense that, the only way I personally use it and in clinic is that flaxseed has been shown in research in urinary metabolism to influence our estrogen. Flaxseed tends to upregulate the favorable pathway of detoxification in the liver of estrogen. So it tends to reduce estrogen dominance without driving impact on estrogen depletion. So it has a really gentle support for estrogen detox, and it's based on the lignans. So you wouldn't want flaxseed oil. You're not using it for the omega-3. Eat the fish for the omega-3.
Gotcha.
You're getting that ALA, and it's the lignan or the stickiness factor of the seed that actually has an influence on our estrogen metabolism. So I recommend using that at times when estrogen is higher, which is more of like early stage of cycle into like day 12 or so. And then that's when progesterone is really supposed to take over. And so then I have that seed cycling approach.
Gotcha.
Like the classic seed cycling is to do flax and pumpkin seed, I want to say, sunflower. I think those are the 3. And I just haven't seen enough. Pumpkin, it's interesting. We always say it's a good source of zinc, but it's also a good source of copper, which when we're talking about like anxiety and such. Zinc can help with that aromatization and testosterone regulation, but I haven't seen any research studies that show an actual hormone implication of any of these other seeds. And then
Gotcha.
the idea of seed cycling is that sesame is higher omega-6 and GLA, and that should be used in the second half of your cycle. I just haven't seen the output where I say like, ooh, this is going to revamp your moon. I don't think it's harmful. Like if you want to do that, that's fine. But I do recommend flaxseed, the whole form. And like, I recommend Flackers just because it's easy, whatever brand, but flax crackers. And just doing like 5 to 6 of them, about 2 tablespoons of whole flaxseed in like days 1 through 12 of your cycle.
Gotcha. Yeah, I skipped over those because I already had my baby. So I was like, I went right to 121, the female hormones. I was like, okay, for the slightly older ladies.
Well, and we talk about like for women that aren't cycling in the other world, if they wanted, because I talk about carb cycling, I think in that episode, or I'm sure I talk about it a lot. But I talk about how menstrual cycle follows, in an ideal world, the moon, right? So that's something you can do if you're dealing with either a lost period, and you're in a cyclical age, and hormonal, or if you're dealing with perimenopause or postmenopause, or you just finished breastfeeding, you can't find your cycle and you're not getting like that ovarian impact or, any of the feedback from the body, you can treat a full moon like ovulation time, and you can treat the new moon like period time. And so that's a way to kind of track and try to create rhythm within the body. And that's where then like seed cycling might be a helpful layer to just like give that little nudge. But the flax is the one that I use clinically.
Yeah, I love how much of your approach is just this kind of try it and see how it works for you and listen to your body. I mean, there's not enough practitioners really encourage people to respect the signals their bodies are giving them. Yeah. And I just really respect that about your approach. So thank you.
I think it's just that all like, again, that doctrine creates disconnect, and we have to lead. I mean, we know when things feel right. We might not know exactly why, and that's okay. Like sometimes I'll say that when I'm working with a patient, like, okay, we're throwing 3 cooks in the kitchen. Like we're putting you on GI lining, we're starting a probiotic, and we're doing this. But the biggest priority is getting you feeling awesome. And then we can like pull the pillars away and from deductive reasoning, figure out what formula you need to stay on, or maybe you stay on all 3 for 6 months and ride out this feel good because you've been in the dumps for so long. But we have to honor the feedback from the body. And yeah, if someone's telling you just try harder, it's not the right way to do it.
Well, Ellie, I really appreciate I've had you on here for an hour now, and I'm sure your daughter is like, where's mommy? So I'm going to let you go. But again, I will put links to a bunch of specific podcast episodes, and then also just the general podcast, the link to the anti-anxiety diet book, which we've mentioned several times, and to your blog. Is there anything else that you wanted to throw in before we leave? Are you going to be at any conferences this year we can come?
I'll be at I was just at Low Carb USA West Palm Beach in January. I'll be at KetoCon lecturing on the main stage in June. And I think I'll have some involvement with PaleoFX. So I'm going to be around.
Great. Well, if you are at PaleoFX, I would love to meet you in person because I'm always there with Mark, of course.
Yeah, definitely.
Thank you so much for your time, Allie. This has just been wonderful. And if you guys are not already listening to Naturally Nourished, I would say put that on the top of your podcast queue because truly, I've been in this space for a while and I still learn so much from every episode, genuinely.
Oh, awesome. Thank you so much. It's my pleasure. It was a fun time.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.